Non-REM parasomnias are parasomnias that occur in non-REM sleep. All parasomnias are most common in children, and they tend to subside by the time we reach adolescence. But it is possible to have parasomnias that continue into adolescence, into adulthood, and can exist for the person's whole entire life. It's just much more rare. We do tend to see them much more frequently in children. So let's take a look and see what some of these parasomnias are, and if we can gather some hints about what's happening in the brain. So let's take a look at sleep terrors. Well, let's just take a look and then we'll talk a little bit about them.
Shh, Josh, it's okay.
What? Hey, Cade. Hey, Cade, wake up. Wake up. You don't know how to wake up? What you do is you sit down.
Sleep terrors is a state of non-REM. In many cases, in sleep terrors, it's like we see in the example of the first child. They are non-verbal, they are non-vocal. No attempts at soothing them tend to help. They tend to be absolutely terrified. As they get older, you can see cases, for example, in the older child who may get up and run around and interact in the room. They may be able to talk, but again, it's fairly nonsensical speaking. These are people who are not rational, they are not thinking, they are trapped in some sort of terror state. So what's occurring is the brain is in a non-REM state and it suddenly awakens. And so what it's doing is it's normally when we're in a non-REM state, we're paralyzed, we're not interacting with the world. In the case of parasomnias, these people somehow get a partial awakening, but the brain is still stuck in that non-REM state, and we can see some of what's firing in there. And what we're seeing here is we're seeing absolute terror, right? Inconsolable, complete terror emerge. There's no memory of this. Sleep terrors tend to not cause any problems for the people that experience them as long as they don't run into anything or hurt themselves out in their terror. They usually don't remember them at all, and they usually be far more traumatic and far scarier for the people around them than they are for the actual individuals. So somehow whatever's happening in non-REM tends to produce this state of inconsolable terror when partially awakened. Somnambulism, right, or sleepwalking, is a parasomnia that tends to occur, again, mostly in children, but can be for lifelong, where people get up and actually move around in their environment. In this case, this girl actually recorded herself because she kept finding her blinds open when she woke up, even though she closed them at night, which was freaking her out. She recorded only to discover that she's the one that's doing it. So as you watch this sleepwalking, notice the stereotyped behaviors, the hypervigilance, right? The grooming activities of the hair, right? And mostly the state of hypervigilance that we tend to see. Somebody who is sleepwalking can engage in a wide variety of activities. And we'll talk about some of the other ones we can see in sleepwalking here in a second, but I really wanted to sort of focus on that state of hypervigilance that we can see here in this video. Right? So again, sleepwalking is a state of non-REM. It can be very difficult to wake somebody who is sleepwalking because they're awake, they're just stuck in a non-REM state. And if you try to, they can sometimes get violent or freak out and endanger themselves or you, which is why it's recommended to try to return sleepwalkers to bed rather than wake them up. When we start combining other activities with sleepwalking, we can get some very strange or dangerous activities. One we call sleep eating occurs when individuals will actually get up in the middle of the night and gather and consume food in their bed. Right? And watch this woman use her pinky to eat the brownie. It's strange. Right? So these people are actually asleep. right? And they're just sitting around eating and consuming food. Right? It's one thing to wake up in the next day and find yourself covered in Dorito dust and Oreo cookies, right? And there's risks of choking and other problems. But many people who experience sleep eating will actually consume raw meats or drink chemicals under the counter, right? This is just this base hunger drives. It just drives people to consume whatever they can get their hands on. Right? So we start combining these elements of terror, of anger, of hypervigilance, of eating. We begin to see that the brain is somehow in a state that is producing very base-driven drives. And if you remember in our neuroanatomy lecture, we talked about a brain system that regulates things like terror and anger and food consumption. Remember what it is? It's what we sometimes call the limbic system, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and to some degree the hippocampus, subcortical regions of the brain that drive these behaviors. Right? If the subcortical regions really were driving these behaviors, there's another element to it that we talked about other than anger and terror and food that we tend to see in the limbic system. Remember the last major thing that's often attributed to the limbic system? Well, sex drive. Right? So if we're really trying to argue that there's some sort of limbic system overactivation in non-REM sleep, we might expect to see something with an overdriven sex drive. And it turns out we often find what's called sexsomnia in non-REM parasomnias. In this case, these are individuals who engage in sexual activities while asleep. By far, the most common actions are self-touching or touching of a partner if they're nearby. But when combined with sleepwalking, there have been cases where people have reported rapes where individuals were said to have been involved in sexsomnia and not fully awake. One well-known case study was one of Kenneth Eckott, who was a young man who was at a party. He got drunk and fell asleep on the couch. A few hours later, he got up, went up the stairs, went into a bedroom where a young girl of 16 was sleeping in the bed. He crawled into the bed and proceeded to try to sexually assault the young girl, who screamed and kicked him. He eventually stopped and returned to the couch where he fell back asleep, only to be arrested a few hours later by the police. Kenneth Eckott actually argued that he was sleepwalking and engaging in this sexual activity through the sexsomnia disorder and was ultimately found not guilty. Whether or not Kenneth Eckott's case and a few others are true reflections of sexsomnia or just a crafty defense put forward by their lawyers is still debated in the field. But there are many respected sleep researchers and psychologists that say this is potentially a real phenomenon. Right? And we can even see in its most extreme form examples of murder. For example, Ken Parks was awoken one morning by his wife screaming as he lay in a puddle of blood. Turned out it was not his blood. Turned out it was his in-laws' blood. Sometime in the night, Ken Parks got up, went to the garage, opened the garage, got into his car, drove his car to his in-laws, went in through the kitchen, went upstairs, and stabbed his mother-in-law hundreds of times, and stabbed his father-in-law dozens of times. The father-in-law ultimately survived. The mother-in-law died. He then returned to his car, drove home, and climbed into bed, where he was awoken the next morning by his wife screaming and covered in blood. Ken Parks claimed to have no memory of this. In fact, Ken Parks was ultimately found not guilty for murder for reasons that he was asleep. Some of the evidence that jurors looked at involved, for example, abnormalities in his EEG patterns while asleep. And you can see that these EEG patterns do not match what we typically see or expect to see in a healthy adult. Ultimately, the jurors said several bits of evidence pointed to them thinking that this was not a normal murder. One of the most dramatic was that Ken Parks actually picked up the knife he used to kill his in-laws in the kitchen, but he grabbed it by the blade. And in process of stabbing them, the knife actually severed through the hand down to the bone. Not a normal response you would find. We've seen some other examples. Matthew Phelps a few years ago called 911 saying he murdered his wife, but claims it was in his sleep and related to the consumption of cold medicine. He tried to put forward the murder sleep defense as well, but ultimately gave it up and pled guilty. Right? So these are borderline cases, but there seems to be some support for it, which tells us that whatever is going on in the non-REM state involves massive activation of the limbic system with little regulation. So the subcortical regions are usually regulated by the cortical regions. So in the non-REM state, those cortical regions seem not to be active. We can contrast this with REM, where we think the cortical abnormalities are active, and we can see that in REM parasomnias.